Everyone, this is Miss Moriarty, and I'm here to discuss with us topic 6.7, which is all about obtaining energy from biomass. Now, biomass is a fuel type that kind of can fall under a lot of different categories. Actually, a couple sources of biomass that could be used could be things like wood from forests. Um, we could see crops being used in terms of biomass, even things like sewage or municipal solid waste could all wind up being combusted, burned to then produce energy. Now, the burning of biomass is really similar to how like nuclear power might be generated through electricity. Same thing with like things like coal, petroleum, and so on. Now, a part of burning anything that might be comprised of biomass, because we know it contains things like hydrogens and carbons, it's going to produce things like CO2, CO, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, maybe even some particulates and VOC compounds when combusted. These are all types of pollutants, whether or not they are greenhouse gases like CO2 or CO, or respiratory irritants like nitrogen oxides and particulates. Now, a part of the drawbacks of using biomass as well, since we know it comes from living things, we tend to see it being over harvested, right? Especially if we're going to be using things like wood as a term of fuel, we can see that deforestation will be a driving factor at the disadvantage for biomass. Now, another form of biomass can be actually refining things like sugar or even corn and then turning into what we call ethanol. Now, ethanol is actually a substitute for gasoline. And if you've ever gone to a gas station and you look at the gas pump, oftentimes you might see maybe like 10% ethanol. This is a substitute that usually gets mixed in with gasoline because burning any ethanol does not actually put in any additional carbon into the atmosphere when combusted. However, the reason why we don't solely depend upon ethanol is its energy return is quite low. So that is why we tend to mix the ethanol with the petroleum in order to get the gasoline that we put in our cars. Now, how does that process technically work? Well, obtaining biofuels like ethanol or even using algae, we would have to grow things like corn or maybe even sugar cane. Those two things may be milled and then eventually fermented into our ethanol and then mixed with gasoline. The environmental consequences of using each and every one of those, especially if we're going to be now mass harvesting a crop, is monoculture, right? We know back from Unit 5, planting one type of crop in a field is going to lower the biodiversity and increase its susceptibility to things like pests or disease. We might also see factors like soil erosion, habitat loss, and even greenhouse gases being released as a result of using things like machinery, fertilizers, and lowering the amount of water available in that area. Now, what about using things like algae? We can actually then grow algae in order to become a biodiesel fuel. However, algae can produce oils, and it is a bit more sustainable than corn, but once again, because it's still coming from a living thing, when it's combusted, it will produce things like greenhouse gases. Now, another form of a biomass or biofuel would be considered what's called biodiesel. These are liquid fuels produced specifically from plant type oils like palm oil, canola, or soy. Palm oil biodiesel, however, has the potential to produce about 98% more greenhouse gases than even fossil fuels. Now, that's not just solely focusing on the combustion of that, that's taking into account the fact that when you go to harvest and grow all the palm oil to become biodiesel, usually you have to then go and clear out a forest. And we know that when we do that, we're going to then increase the greenhouse gases in that area. So, although it can be more sustainable if that cleared land is actually then reused, however, we know that causes of those environmental impacts tend to come from agriculture. So, overall, what are our advantages, disadvantages, pros, cons of using biomass as an energy source? Well, a pro would be a domestic benefit. Usually, biomass you tend to get from a more localized area. So, what that can do is reduce any trade deficit that that country may have. It might be able to create jobs in that local area because now you're using the raw materials already found there. We know that biomass is still considered a renewable resource as long as we don't use it in the rate in which that it can replenish. We know that carbon cycle to reduce any buildup of greenhouse gases can be implemented. So if we tend to mix ethanol with gasoline, we might be able to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And we know that as we continue to improve any technologies, we can start to see an even greater reduction in cost using this fuel type. Now, cons. It is lower in terms of its energy density compared to things like fossil fuels, like coal or petroleum. Um, the solids might be difficult to handle, and they tend to have a very high water content because they're coming from a living organism. If we're using things like corn or sugarcane, we know that it has a high food value, which can kind of compete for its value as a fuel type. Um, in harvesting something for this, right, we're going to need a lot of it. So it has the potential to impact any symbiotic relationship that any insects or organisms might have with that producer, and any commercial issues we may come up. So we might see production technologies may not be catching up to what they need to be. The finance of using biomass and ensuring that it lowers greenhouse gases may come into as being an issue. Now, remember, guys, this is the end of this video. So as you watch, make sure that you took notes. Please mark this as done. Come Monday, be ready to discuss pros and cons of biomass and continue to work on our energy superhero villain debate.